Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day you're watching this. I do hope it finds you well. My name is John, and welcome to my writing corner. Here today on the Storytime Thursday, I'm going to be reading chapter 13 of my first book, The Shadow of the Past, entitled Takaran, Citadel of Camral. Start off with, please, I'd really appreciate it if you like, share, subscribe, leave a comment. I would love to hear your feedback on the chapter, any of the contents, the story so far, anything else, as well as check out my other videos. There'll be a link at the end to the rest of the videos in this series. Grab some water, whatever your beverage of choice is, buckle in, and here it is. Chapter 13, Takaran, Citadel of Camral. The Dancer of Dawn had been at sea for nearly 3 weeks when they at last sighted their goal. Just as Urgar was starting to get used to being aboard the ship, the Bay of Lace began to appear on the horizon. He had thought that the journey would take longer, but he heard the sailors say that they had never heard of the wind filling sails so consistently throughout a voyage, even after they rounded the Cape of Val'inar. Urgar was not sure whether it was his elven companion or one of the spirits he was seeking which propelled them onwards. As soon as the ship put ashore, Urgar was thankful that he had been able to keep breakfast down that morning. The work of unloading the ship, overstocked as it was with provisions, was a strenuous one, and everyone's help was needed. It was well after midnight by the time the work finished, whereupon the sailors began erecting tents, and the company of soldiers they had brought with them began marking out a place a short distance from the shore to build a palisade to protect the landings. As soon as a tent was set up for them, Urgar joined Lady Myra and Val'inar to talk strategy. Val'inar began to speak first. "This has to be the Bay of Lace," he said, indicating the map spread out on the table before them. "There are no other bays like this on the east coast of Camral. It's a wonder that Camral has never built a city or a harbor out here." "Too many storms," said Lady Myra simply. "With the coastline that surrounds this bay as rocky as it is, the winds that blow up in from the west during fall and winter would mean almost certain destruction to any ship attempting to anchor here, and a lot of damage to any harbor facility." "I trust this bay will serve our purpose then?" inquired Urgar. The elf nodded. "This bay is easily defensible from its landward side, and it is unlikely that either Camral or the Union have any scouts out this far. They will think all their enemies to be west and north of them." "Surely there are still people of Camral around?" inquired Urgar. Val'inar shrugged. "There isn't a major settlement for some distance down the coast, and this rocky terrain is not good for farming. There are bound to be a few fishermen, perhaps a small village or two, but I doubt they'll pay us much mind. And they probably don't even know who the Union is anyway. The Union is unlikely to have spies out this far." "That's as maybe, but it will also be difficult to move an army from here," grumbled Lady Myra. "It will take us at least a week to reach the area of Takaran." "If all goes as planned, they will not know of your approach until you are within sight of the city," Urgar reminded her gently. That is quite some if," said Lady Myra testily. "And if the city is barred to us, we'll never be able to take it. The army of the Union is much larger than ours, as are the armies of Camral. One would be enough to crush us, and if they are both allied with each other—" "It is our job to see that does not happen," Val'inar reminded them. "And if my information is accurate, while the Union is in control of Camral, in all but name, the people are decidedly unhappy about it." "And they have slain King Ertol in secret and are essentially ruling in his name," Myra continued. "I know. Our agents have given us the same reports, but you will still need proof to raise the people of Camral, and a healthy dose of convincing as well." "Where is the main Union army now?" inquired Val'inar. "I got a report on that last night from on one of the Pertex I have," answered Urgar. "Narfin says that dwarven scouts have spotted the main Union army camped on the north marches of Camral. That puts them about 5 days from Takaran, for if they force the march, although their cavalry could make it the journey in two." "It is as I figured," mused Val'inar. "They are worried Camral will rise against them. We have a very dangerous game to play. We have we have to have the support of Camral if we are to succeed, but if we miss our timing, then the Union will crush us before we can gain their support." Did this Narthan inform you how large the Union's army is? Asked Myra. The dwarven scouts could only get within sight of the camps, but he said that there may be as much as 10,000 horse, a mix of armored and lancers, 10,000 archers, 15 full legions of foot soldiers, several hundred mages, and a whole array of sea equipment. All told, perhaps 120,000 men, responded Urgar gravely. Lady Myra whistled under her breath. We can't field a quarter of that number. And what of the dwarves? Narthan said they are raising all the soldiers they can, but by his estimate his force combined with that of Romalda will perhaps equal half the number of the Union. How soon can the army of Camral be mustered? Inquired Myra. They alone can match the number of the Union. Urgar shrugged. A month, perhaps more. They can put knights and men-at-arms in field more quickly than that, but they'll need to call their levies to match the Union's numbers, and unfortunately Camral's a vast realm at present. That is true, admitted Val'inar, but oftentimes surprise will make up greatly for numbers. We are fortunate that Ushara has spurned the dwarves thus, so it is unlikely that she has a spy amongst them. And expelling the Union forces from Romalda will blind them to your movements as well. This did not ease the worries of Lady Myra, who paced up and down beside the table before speaking again. Yes, and we are taking a great risk to bring our army here. The sea is treacherous even in summer, and we are leaving our borders dangerously unprotected. The Union is made up largely of the Telmaran Confederation, and they have long been our enemy, and stronger than us, at least on land. Val'inar smiled and nodded before indicating the map on the table. But as you told me yourself, the Union cannot move into Romalda without first taking the fortresses on your common border, which, even if lightly defended, would take a long siege. It was Urgar that chimed in at this point. Remember, my lady, that Camral is far more dangerous to the Union than Romalda. It has ever been Camral that has checked the aggression of Telmar, as the Iron Lord learned to his downfall 2 centuries ago. They must keep their main army here until Camral is firmly under their control. To do otherwise could bring disaster to whatever the Union is planning. Thank you, Master Goblin. I know my history, retorted Myra, but we are still putting our army in danger, and there is little guarantee that the Lords of Camral will welcome our assistance or our presence in their lands. After all, they have warred with Romalda in the past as well, and are not likely to have forgotten the embarrassment the Storm Prince gave them for nearly a decade before they finally ended his rule. Val'inar nodded gravely, but seemed to have already made up his mind. You both raise good points, and for the moment we must look to what is in our power to decide. Lady Myra, there should be sufficient resources in this area to build strong encampments, and though the area is rough, there should be enough supplies between forage and what you were able to bring with you. Urgar, we must leave as soon as our packs may be filled. We have a long road ahead of us to Takaran, longer in that we must travel around the city so it looks like we are arriving from the north. I do not doubt that the Union will eventually figure out how we came here with such speed, but the longer we can delay them from that conclusion, the better our chances will be. Lady Myra nodded her head in affirmation to this and set about to ordering packs prepared for elf and goblin. As the waiting soldiers did as they were bid, she addressed some final words to her erstwhile companions. I wish that I could come with you, but there is certainly wisdom in my staying here to organize things once our army begins to arrive. We can live off this land for a time, and hopefully without attracting too much attention. Good luck to both of you in the tasks that are ahead of you. Travel swiftly, and be watchful for other travelers. I thank you for your kind words, Lady Myra, responded Val'inar. Look for messengers from the Tri who I hope to encounter before we reach Takaran. With these words, Val'inar and Urgar shouldered their packs that had just been brought to them and set off through the gate of the slowly rising palisade. Rolling hills formed the border between the great plain of Shaddai and the Rhinal Sea. Val'inar had contemplating sending a message to the elves which he had heard lived on the shores of Rhinal, but they lived quite close to the lands the Union controlled. So, if they had not already been conquered or wiped out, they would likely risk open confrontation with the Union. Even if that were not the case, Val'inar did not think they would have aided him. The Rhinal elves were few in number, and like their cousins of Taranu, they cared little for the troubles of the lands outside their own, their only contact being the occasional trader. More than that, even, Val'inar thought to himself, I could feel them as the dancer passed near to their realm. I could feel their essences within the area if I stretched out my mind to do so. Even though he had never been told thus, he knew almost instinctively that what he had felt meant that they were beginning to lose themselves, just as their northern kin had long ago. If nothing changed in 1,000 years or so, there would be no longer anything that could be called an elf living on the shores of Rhino. They journeyed largely in silence for the first day, stopping only once to take some food. Urgar could sense that Val'inar was troubled by something, but felt it best not to disturb the thoughts of his companion. Urgar would have found it difficult to hold a conversation with the elf regardless. Val'inar was making haste, which meant that Urgar at times almost had to jog to keep up with his long-shanked companion. They stepped they stopped only for a few hours of sleep at that night and on the following 2 nights as well, and ate while they were moving. The dried meat, fruit, and bread that the Romaldans had provided them had substance to it, and was good traveling food to be sure, but after the third day Urgar was beginning to long for a proper meal. When he mentioned this to Val'inar, the elf had smiled and said that he agreed, but Urgar was beginning to suspect that Val'inar could probably have made this journey without food, and perhaps without rest as well. Urgar had known the elf for more than a month now, and while he had all the same information that Val'inar had about the task they had embarked on, Val'inar rarely spoke his mind. He had mentioned this to Lady Myra only a few days before they landed, and she had said much the same thing. The elf was honest and friendly, but he did not communicate his mind to those around him. Having traveled so long with him, Urgar was starting to get a sense of him. He thought the elf unquestionably brave, intelligent, and determined in his task, but beneath that there seemed to be a deep fear of whether or not he was doing the right thing, and a strong desire and hope that he could find a way to avoid killing his enemies. Despite proposing the daring plan they were now upon, it was Val'inar who had spoken most strongly against destroying the army of the Union, saying that the men in that army were by and large deluded and innocent. All present had agreed when pressed, but this was probably correct, but it was still likely they must be destroyed. It had taken much convincing before Val'inar relented upon that score. Above all, what puzzled Urgar the most was that Val'inar often seemed to be at the same time naive in the ways of the world and wise beyond his years. He suspected this latter element had something to do with his conversations with the elementals, which he refused to speak to anyone about, and repeatedly rebuffed all questions concerning. Urgar did not know what had been told to Val'inar. Whatever it was, he guessed it must have been some truly terrible secrets to concern him so. Urgar trusted Val'inar, but he was still not sure whether the elf was going to lead them to salvation or ruin, especially since Urgar did not fully see what ruin Val'inar was trying to save them from. On top of it all was the fact that Val'inar was clearly troubled during those brief hours that he actually slept. Whenever it was Urgar's turn to watch, so Val'inar might get a few hours rest, the elf always seemed to fear going to sleep. When he finally did drop off, it rarely took very long before the elf began to writhe, as if some great terror gripped him. Urgar always faintly hoped that in his sleep Val'inar would say something that would give the goblin some clue as to what he was dreaming about, but that never happened, except the occasional vague mutterings about it is opening or he is coming. This concerned Urgar, for although seers were well respected among his own people, rare though they were, so far as he knew from his history, there had never been a seer that was so regularly tormented by visions. Urgar often found himself hoping that Val'inar was dreaming of something that had already happened, but he knew in his gut that his companion's dreams were not fueled by memory or fever, but rather prescience. It was on the fourth day that the companions caught sight of Takaran. Urgar had heard stories from traders about the size and majesty of the great Citadel of Camral, but nothing had quite prepared him for what he saw. He judged that they would not reach it until tomorrow, but even many leagues off, it still seemed to cover the horizon. The walls of Takaran were gray and stretched around a vast city that, from a distance, looked like an intricately carved heap of gray stone. It was flecked with reds and blues and yellows of the various other stones that made up buildings within the city. On the eastern side of the city which they faced was the citadel itself. Urgar knew that its proper name was the Citadel of the Battling Wind, but for millennia it had been known throughout the Terra simply as the Citadel. The citadel was made entirely of white stone, which Urgar reflected must require regular cleaning. It stood atop a rock that seemed to erupt right out of the plains. The city came right up to the citadel on the gentle western slope of the rock, but to the east was a great plunge 500 feet into a deep ravine. The ravine jutted its way about a mile into the plain, growing shallower as it went until its walls grew even with the surrounding grassland, and from it sprouted the river Tuscara. It was said by some that this ravine, which had a, which from a distance looked like the rock the citadel was built upon, had cracked the earth itself when it jutted up into the plains, was a secret way into the citadel. Over the millennia, many attackers had tried to exploit this rumor, but none had succeeded. It was said that in the entire recorded history of Camral, even through all its great ups and downs over the years, it had never been taken by storm. Urgar could see why. The citadel's walls were 3 times the thickness of those of Takaran itself and faced the direction of the city. It would cost an enemy dearly to take even the city, should its walls be strongly held, but taking the citadel would take an army beyond reckoning. There was also the fact that the heart of the citadel was a gleaming white tower which stretched some 300 feet into the heavens and looked like a great spear. Urgar wagered that one could see an enemy while they were still several days off from that vantage point. Planning to approach the city from the north, the two companions had turned north as soon as they caught sight of the city. Urgar hoped that no one from the city could see them, even from the top of the tower, but Val'inar assured him that even if they could be seen, they were not being looked for. Val'inar was more concerned about the many villages and farms that they were now passing. They avoided them where they could, but trusted that what eyes did see them saw nothing more than two traveling companions traveling toward Takaran, a common enough sight. It was getting towards evening when Urgar first noticed the faint sound of hooves hitting the ground, which was soon accompanied by the rustling sound of riders moving swiftly through the tall grass, which stood to their left. Urgar looked and saw a troop of horsemen, perhaps a dozen strong, making towards them with some speed. At first, Urgar feared that they were knights of Camral, but as they got closer, Urgar saw that most of the men on horse were armed with bows and arrows, and armored only in loose tunics and leather jerkins. As they crested the hill nearest, Urgar noticed that the leader of the horsemen was a woman. She did not seem to be armed, but she had a great many bangles upon her arms. Her raven-colored hair streamed loosely behind her as her horse galloped, and she seemed to only be wearing a long, loose skirt of gray and a piece of blue cloth that was wrapped several times around her chest. "We have been spotted," observed Urgar. Are these the Tri that you have told me about? If they are not, I fear that we are in some trouble." Val'inar did not turn to look at the horsemen, which would be on them any moment. "Yes, they are indeed of the Tri Shalta, and they have been tailing us since we left the camp by the sea. I told Desalia to keep a close watch upon the Shedai plains, should I have need of her, and she clearly has done her job well." "Why have they only approached us now?" inquired Urgar. "Like as not, they were not sure who we were," responded Val'inar. "Last time I encountered them, Narthan was with me, and they might well have been told to watch for an elf and a dwarf, not an elf and a goblin. It might also have something to do with the fact that I no doubt frightened the Quar who leads them. She sent a whole wind. She sent a wind towards evening to test our resolve, and sensing her power woven within the will, I contended with her." I'll wait a second for my dogs to shut up. You're fine, guys. Anyway, while they were having this conversation, the tri-band was cresting the ridge upon which Urgar and his companions were walking. Urgar feared for a moment that they meant to ride them down, but each of the dozen horsemen reined in their mounts with practiced ease and trotted the last few yards until the Quar that led them stopped not 10 feet from Val'inar. The Quar dismounted and approached Val'inar, though the men did not. Up close, Urgar saw that she had brown skin, dark eyes, a wide smile, and strong hands. Urgar judged her to be somewhere in her 30s, although the way that the wind had hardened her face made it difficult to be sure, and the goblin had difficulty telling with humans anyway. The woman began talking in a strong, commanding voice to Val'inar in the language of her people. To Urgar, this sounded like nothing more than a tangled collection of sounds, although not unpleasant to the ears, but Val'inar seemed to understand her. What did she say? Inquired Urgar, his curiosity much piqued. Val'inar translated. Her name is Serena, and she apologizes that she did not approach sooner, but she had been under the impression that I would be accompanied by a dwarf, and they were being careful to avoid notice. And she said that she likes goblins better than dwarves. And why is that? Asked Urgar, amused. Val'inar turned to translate, but the woman, clearly able to at least understand the trade language, began speaking almost immediately. Because she's because she says the Tri do not like the feel of dwarves, Val'inar provided. They feel of darkness and confinement, which the people of the wind loathe above all else. And what does a goblin feel of? They have little dealings with your kind, conveyed Val'inar, but you feel to her like fire and metal in the mountain air, better by far than the darkness dwarves seem to carry with them. But she doubts that you would find any more comfort a horse than a dwarf. Urgar laughed aloud. That is certainly something we goblins have in common with dwarves. Val'inar and Harina then set to a brief conversation in the Tri language. After it had concluded, Harina nodded firmly and gracefully swung herself back onto her horse, which had been unconcernedly grazing where it had stopped. With a single command, which Urgar could not quite make out, the riders set off at speed and were soon pounding east back down the ridge. Before they were lost from sight, Urgar saw a crow rise swiftly from the riders and wing its way to the west. Urgar turned to Val'inar with a quizzical look on his face, and the elf filled him in on the conversation. After Dasalia had been informed that a powerful elf had been sighted, she commanded Harina to make contact immediately and both relay and obey any instructions which he should have for the tribe people. Val'inar then asked her to convey his thankfulness to Dasalia, and asked that Dasalia should bring the full might of the tribe to Takaran with all speed. He explained to her the likelihood of there being a great battle in or around the city soon, and their forces had to be ready. Harina had nodded in affirmation to these instructions and asked if there were any others, to which Val'inar had replied that they should spread their scouts out around the city and monitor the movements of the Union and its forces carefully, and also make contact with the Benaran dwarves so as to coordinate their forces. Harina had then asked if there was anything Val'inar wished her and her band to do. Val'inar had informed her that he desired that she make all haste to the coast and present herself to Lady Myra as both her eyes and ears as well as her line of communication. Harina had expressed interest in the fact that she was not aware that men of iron and stone, as she called them, allowed women to fight and lead. Val'inar had then informed her that, while they did not ride to war as often as men, both Camral and Romalda taught the arts of war to women as well as men, and that Lady Myra was not only capable, but her skills had thus far proved essential. Harina had replied that she looked forward to meeting Lady Myra, and that if they had any need of contacting the Tri, they merely had to progress out in the plains and one of their scouts would make contact. With that, she had ridden I love my dogs, but anyway. Guys, stop. I appreciate your enthusiasm, but you're not part of the fire department. All right. Editing around a little bit, my dog's going nuts at a passing emergency vehicle. With that having been explained and looking like a great weight had been lifted from him, Val'inar resumed his long strides onward to the north, which forced Urgar to jog for a moment in order to catch up. They camped next to a small stream some hours later after night had fallen, but were up again by daybreak. It was midday when they began to move more westward, and near the evening when they found themselves on the great northern road, which ran from the north gate of Takaran all the way to the great city of Turlin, the southernmost of the Union cities. Figuring that the risks of being caught immediately were far greater if they tried to gain entry to the city by night, they rested in a convenient little dale several miles from the northern gate and perhaps a quarter-mile west of the road. Urgar was awakened an hour or so after dawn, if he was any judge by Val'inar. Upon waking, he heard the faint rumbling of wagons moving along the road. Elf and Goblin took a quick breakfast of dried beef and bread before returning to the road and joining in with the traders that were traveling to Takaran to ply their wares. If any of them were surprised at all about the sudden arrival of two new travelers, they did not show it, and Urgar doubted any paid them mind, given the fact that it was one of the busiest trade routes in all of the Terra, and it was getting into the heart of summer. The only thing that concerned Urgar was that there might be some thieves among the traders, as there often were. Neither he nor his elven companion were wearing fine clothing, but he did not doubt that the occasional glint of the steel they were both wearing could be seen by the careful eye, no matter how carefully they might be try to hide it. Urgar knew that there was nothing to fear from thieves, doubting very much that even a fairly large company of thieves could best Val'inar, but he did fear that an attempt by said thieves would force Val'inar to reveal his skills, which would well give away their identity. They reached the northern gate about an hour later. Urgar saw up close that the walls of Takaran rose about 20 feet off the ground, and his keen and appraising eyes also saw the great many places that the wall had been repaired, and even a few places that were in need of some repair, mostly due to the crumbling of age. Urgar also saw that the walls were made of common stone, which was no doubt mined in the Dresh Mountains to the north and east. He could not say for sure whether enchantments had been woven into the stone, although even if there were, such common stone could not stand forever against determined salts, nor the slow ravages of time, for that matter. The gates were guarded by a half dozen soldiers wearing the livery of the Union. This was not unexpected, but it still gave Urgar pause. If they noticed that an elf and goblin were among those who entered the city, he could not say, however, because they were not stopped or even given any notice at all. Urgar took this as a good sign, although the thought that this could be some kind of trap gnawed at the corner of his thoughts. After passing through the main gate and under the portcullis on the far side, Urgar noted the guardhouses on either side. Both of them would contain a score or more soldiers by his guess, possibly more. There were no alleys or turnoffs on the long street to the square of bronze scales, just a long row of thin two-storied houses, which looked to be made of the sandstone that was commonly found on the plains. The street was busy with people coming and going, with deep ruts in the cobblestones to mark the path of the many carts that daily came to and from the city. This was nothing to compare to the square of bronze scales, however. The square, so named for the fountain at its center, which was a gigantic bronze scale with water spouting from it, was vast and contained a great many people, although at a guess Urgar would have said that it was only half full. Great crowds milled between the various shops, which offered everything from the rarest unguents made from flowers found only on the Crimson Isles far to the west, to try short bows and everything in between. In between shops and scattered throughout the square were carts of every size with merchants from all over Sirana, pleading, enticing, and even threatening the people milling about the square to buy their merchandise. Most of these merchants were human, but Urgar observed a fair number of dwarves and goblins among them, and even the occasional elf plying his trade. The crowd itself showed a similar mix of people. As they had planned the night before, Urgar and Val'inar split up and slowly made their way around the square, pretending to be interested in what various people had to sell. Their real purpose, however, was to gather information. Most of the chatter Urgar heard over the course of the day was concerned only with merchandise and the petty wants and needs of the shoppers. However, Urgar did occasionally catch a snatch of, "They say the king is very ill," or, "I don't see why our own soldiers have to be dismissed." And there was one man who had even whispered quietly to a fellow shopper, both men looking very much like soldiers, "I still say we've been conquered without the sword being swung." For Urgar also chatted with a few of the merchants who also seemed concerned with what was going on. However, if Urgar got to the point of asking any direct questions, they always seemed to clam up quickly as if they were going to get themselves in trouble. The only merchant he had been able to get more than a few words out of was a goblin merchant who was quite chatty, but unfortunately had only come recently to the city and could offered no more than the same rumors which had reached his ears on the Orthrus Mountains months ago. A few dwarven merchants who eyed him suspiciously as he approached their cart threatened to call the guards after he had uttered his first question. He managed to talk them out of doing so by claiming that he was trying to see if he could get any new information, because he was thinking of setting up a shop in Takaran. Urgar and Val'inar met up again at the fountain as the light of day was fading and the square was beginning to empty. It seemed that Val'inar had no better luck, nothing but the occasional whisper or scrap of old information, but nothing concrete or new. The whispers did seem to give Val'inar hope, however, as it indicated to him that the people of Takaran were not happy with the way things were going. As they walked toward a large inn called the Gilded Spear, which had been recommended to Val'inar by a Tri merchant, the elf said to himself as much as to Urgar, "We can just give them a cause to do so. We can get these people on our side." "I agree," whispered Urgar, nodding his head in assent, "but this is not the place to talk of such things. In a city like this, the streets themselves are likely to have ears. Even once we have acquired a room, I caution against speaking so openly. The walls in a tavern are often thin, and who knows whether there will be friend or foe listening on the other side." Val'inar conceded the wisdom in this and remained silent until they had reached the Gilded Spear. It was a large and comfortable inn run by a pleasant and plump woman with white hair who looked to be well into her sixth decade, if Urgar was any judge. She greeted elf and goblin pleasantly and freely gave them a room with two beds. She barked at a tall and spindly youth to show the guests to their rooms, and invited them to join the commons for dinner, which was to be suckling pig, well-aged cheese, apples, and all the mead they could drink. However, Urgar did mark, as they were following the lad up to their room, that she gave them a queer look and muttered something he couldn't quite hear about the oddity of an elf and a goblin traveling together, which left him wondering whether news of them had already reached Takaran. If it had that, if it had, then the innkeeper, who said her right name was Denisha, but was but that most called her Snow, short for Snowhead, on account of the fact that her hair had suddenly turned white when she was 5 and 20, did not show it, or at least didn't report it. They spent the evening eating and chatting with the other patrons in the inn without any soldiers arriving. The meal was pleasant, as was the company. If any others thought Val'inar and himself were odd, they did not share it. Even the party of dwarves staying at the inn talked pleasantly with him, while they were well into their cups by the time elf and goblin had come down to dinner. Wanting to take in as much information as they could, Val'inar and Urgar were among the last to leave the common room well after nightfall and return to their rooms. Urgar was glad of having had a proper meal and a proper bed to sleep in, even though the beds at the inn were rather softer than he preferred. It seemed to Urgar that he had just dropped off to sleep when he was awakened suddenly as if by instinct. Urgar sat up quickly, and his eyes adjusted to the darkness. He saw a dozen dark shapes standing in the room. Before he could call out, a large hand clamped vice-like upon his mouth, and several other strong hands pinned his arms to his side. A whispered voice warned him that should he attempt to weave any spells, he would be knocked unconscious, just as a bag was placed over his head. The last thing he saw, his eyes not adjusted to the light, was the elf being given the same treatment. Urgar felt his arms bound with thick rope, and he was led stumbling several times in the dark from the room. At no part did Urgar's other senses tell him that there was less than half a dozen men in very close proximity to him. And that is the end of the chapter. I really hope you enjoyed it. If so, please leave your comments on, or really, if you have any feedback whatsoever on the content of the chapter, the writing, the story so far, characters, anything. I would love to hear it. I'd love to hear your feedback. Also, I greatly appreciate it if you take the time to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss another video or more continuations of me reading my book. Also, on that point, please check out my books. They are linked below. I really appreciate your time here. I hope you all have a wonderful day, get a chance to do or experience something creative, and I will catch you on the next one.